The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
What to eat for dinner? It's a deceptively simple question with huge implications, both for your health and the nation's. About 1 in 3 Americans are obese, and health problems related to obesity are costing us $150 billion a year. In his provocative new book, In Defense of Food, journalist Michael Pollan says that America's food industries have led us down the wrong path when choosing what to put on our dinner table. We'll break down his arguments with 2 UW experts on food science and nutrition as we tackle the science and politics of food. Next, during office hours. I'm Ken Goldstein, Professor of Political Science at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Here at UW-Madison, we're embarking on a common book project, and the book we're reading is In Defense of Food by Michael Pollan. Here to analyze some of the book's fundamental claims and show how we should digest the many claims made about our food are Susan Nitzke and Irwin Goldman, both from the UW College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Susan is a professor and chair of the Department of Nutritional Sciences. Her research and outreach focuses on human nutrition, and she's also chair of the statewide Anti-Obesity Coalition. Irwin Goldman is a professor of horticulture and the vice dean of the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences. He's done extensive research on plant genetics and plant breeding to enhance the nutritional value of vegetables. Susan, Irwin, thanks very much for joining us today on Office Hours. So I think we're going to get into a little bit of the controversy and get into discussion about many of the normative, political, empirical claims that Michael Pollan is making. But his first principle is essentially that the conventional American diet isn't working, that we've got a big health problem on our hands. That's not controversial, right?
We have a big health problem on our hands isn't as controversial as the first part. I mean, we have a wonderful diet in the United States, but there's room for improvement. Whether all our health problems are due to just food products in the stores is, I think, a great oversimplification.
Okay, what's the problem?
What's the problem, with that assertion?
No, what's the health problem now that we're facing?
Yes, the biggest public health problem in this country is obesity and the related diseases, the biggest of which is diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is pretty much caused by being overweight, and it's becoming more and more common as our population ages, and also as people become fatter. So we see more type 2 diabetes. We see it in younger children than we've ever seen it before. And it's a huge, expensive, burdensome problem for the individual and for our society. So that part is indisputable.
Okay. So Pollan uses the term, Irwin, industrial agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
What does industrial agriculture mean?
I think it's largely a system that developed after World War II in this country, incredibly productive in terms of efficient food production, largely based on inputs of petroleum, both in terms of powering the farm machinery, petroleum to make the fertilizers that help grow the crops. Very, very intense monoculture, both in terms of crop and animal production.
Let me interrupt you for a second. What does monoculture mean?
Monoculture, reducing the diversity on the farm to single species, so large fields of corn, large fields of soybean, rather than a farm that, say, before World War II might have had a very large diversity of crops and animals on the farm. Industrial agriculture is a system where that's been refined and increasingly focused on individual species production so that you get the most efficient use of the land.
So if we jumped in a car, or knowing you, jumped on a bike and drove 5 or 6 miles from here,
mm-hmm.
How different would it look now than if we would have done that 50 or 60 years ago and what we'd see on Wisconsin farms?
That's a great question, and indeed it would have looked very different. I think Michael Pollan and others have explained that the diversified farms of the Midwest that had animals integrated in with crops and a diversity of both animals and crops would look very different than the patchwork we'd see at 30,000 feet flying over this area now, which is very large banks of individual species such as corn, soybeans, or confined animal feeding operations.
Now, when he talks about industrial agriculture, he's also talking about food engineering, genetic modification. Is that part and parcel of it? And that's your real area of expertise.
Well, the plant breeding part is my area, and although we haven't done any genetic engineering in my research program, it's certainly a mainstay of U.S. agriculture. And it's really only about 13 years old. So it really isn't until about 1995, 96 that you see farmers starting to grow genetically engineered crops. Plant breeding, on the other hand, has been around for 10,000 years, the conventional method of improving crops. But this genetic engineering and genetic improvement is something that farmers increasingly have come to depend on for that margin, for the profit margin of their crops that they grow.
So talk to me for a second about someone in the Euphrates Valley, you know, maybe grafting two plants together.
Sure.
And what genetic modification here is a really scary word.
It is, and you know, but it's interesting that that in itself is a very, very traditional part of agriculture, a very traditional part of farming, to cross two high-yielding plants, grow out the offspring, and select the best. That is something that's been going on since the beginning, since 10,000 years ago, since agriculture started. And as science came in, particularly the science of genetics, which really wasn't understood until the beginning of the 20th century, as that came in, it became much more scientific, much more systematic. But it was always about crossing related plants or crossing related animals, closely related. Genetic engineering opens up the opportunity to cross the species boundary, to cross even the kingdom boundary, and use genes, say, from a fish in a plant. And that really presents some unique challenges that society has never faced.
So if we can sum up the argument, it's more oil, less sun, also oil products going into fertilizer.
Yes.
Also more petroleum used to drive the stuff from the farm all around, and more oil used to run the combines, and also more use of genetically modified food. So that's what he means by industrial agriculture. He's then going to make some very, very specific suggestions about what we should do on our kitchen table. And when we come back, I'm going to turn to Susan and have her tell us what those specific suggestions are, and then have a discussion about whether that makes sense. So please stay with us on Office Hours as we talk about Michael Pollan and his book, In Defense of Food.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
For more than 100 years, the University of Wisconsin has been inspired by the Wisconsin idea,
which says the good work of the university extends to the boundaries of the state and beyond.
So the UW works hard to help build Wisconsin's economy.
Educate people of all ages.
Advance health and medicine.
And enhance the quality of life for all of us.
Hit it!
The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours. We're discussing the science and the politics of food with Irwin Goldman and Susan Nitzke. So Susan, Irwin, we went out on one of the great spots of all college campuses, the terrace at the University of Wisconsin, and asked some University of Wisconsin students some questions on nutrition. So let's go to one of those student questions right now.
Hi, I'm Jillian. I'm a senior journalism and Spanish major, and I was just wondering how our diet of processed food affects our health as a nation.
Big question. I'm sure you teach entire classes on that, but it's TV, so we'll have to go quicker. Let's answer the student question, and also speak to Michael Pollan's argument there, in which the way he would answer it is he would say simply, the modern American diet is a complete public health catastrophe. What's your view? How do you answer that?
Well, I think it's easy to oversimplify and exaggerate and use hyperbole and make very interesting statements that aren't very useful for telling people what to do and what kind of decisions to make. I think the modern American diet could use some improvement, but I think it's also a wonderful resource that we have in this country that we've been taking for granted for so long, that we've let some of the quality issues go unnoticed, and maybe they do need more attention. Whether it's a catastrophe, I think I would take issue with. And whether the problem can be summarized by the word processed is also, as Irwin mentioned, with the words genetic engineering. processed food, I mean, in my grandmother's day, flour was processed food. At what degree does processing become too much of a good thing, I think would be a more useful way to look at it.
So speaking of your grandmother, that's a good segue, because one of Michael Pollan's big recommendations is don't eat anything your grandmother wouldn't recognize. Now, in my case, that might not be such a great idea, but you know, he does have these very simplified rules. Could you sort of sum them up and what your take on the validity of those rules is?
Well, there's three main rules, which is eat food not too much and mostly plants. And those three main rules are pretty hard to argue with. They make a lot of sense. But when he explains how to follow them, that's when he gets into things like don't eat anything your grandmother or maybe even your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize. I think maybe for a lot of people watching your show, their grandmother or their great-grandmother might have recognized Jell-O and Kool-Aid. That doesn't necessarily make them nutritious either. And there's some modern foods that I think are very nutritious, and I wouldn't want people to dismiss just because they weren't around 100 years ago. So, you know, it's a principle that could easily be taken too far.
He also claims that you shouldn't eat anything that makes a health claim.
That's right.
So no oatmeal.
That's isn't that amazing? Yes. I think what you should do is maybe ignore the health claims or look into them and make sure that they have some basis. There are a lot of different types of food claims that are allowed on the front of a cereal box, for example. And there are very strict regulations about how they can be used. But the regulations have, in the past maybe 20 years, been very much loosened, so that now we have little symbols, little check marks and things like that that end up to be a lot of confusing information, and it's not tightly controlled as it was in 20 or 30 years ago. So I think there is a lot of confusion, and that's why I advise consumers to turn the box around, look at the ingredient list, and look at the nutrition facts panel, because those are very tightly regulated, very tightly specified. If you start with the ingredient list, if the first ingredient is whole grain flour, then you'll know you're buying a product made with whole grains. If the first ingredient is one of the many names for sugar, and you're looking for food that's good for your body, then you might look for another brand that might have a better start on the ingredient list, because the ingredients are there in order of predominance by weight.
When we come back on office hours, you've given us some advice, and you made a point that Michael Pollan's advice might be a little too simplified or even exaggerated in his rhetoric. He also has advice to policymakers about what we should do on the farm. So when we come back on office hours, I want to talk to Irwin about that. Whether you also believe that advice is too simplified and exaggerated. Hope you'll stay with us when we tackle that on office hours. Welcome back to Office Hours, where we're discussing the science and politics of food in America. So one of the core arguments in defense of food is that most of the problems, virtually all of the problems in our food system today, are because of our reliance on fossil fuels. And in a New York Times Magazine article, which Michael Pollan wrote as an open letter to the president-elect last October, he writes this as a solution. Sunlight nourishes the grasses and grains, the plants nourish the animals then nourish the soil, which in turn nourishes the next season's grasses and grains. Animals on pasture can also harvest their own feed and dispose of their own waste, all without our reliance on fossil fuel. So that says that we shouldn't do monoculture, we should go back to the way farms were 50 or 60 years ago, and it's beautifully written. Can that magic just happen? Can we still feed America, still feed the world by doing this?
It's unlikely. It's a beautiful sentiment, and that kind of an integrated nutrient cycling throughout that farm is an ideal way to be part of agriculture. And eating, after all, is an agricultural act, and so the fact if you can eat through a system like that, it's maybe the best way to do agriculture. But in the long run, the productivity that's needed, not only by the United States, but by the world, requires systems that are much more productive and much more industrial in nature. In fact, if you just rely on the nitrogen that a system like that can produce, you simply cannot produce enough calories to feed the people that we have in this country. So synthetic nitrogen or other sources of nitrogen besides animal manure become a necessity.
Let me jump on nitrogen here for a second, if I can say that. So nitrogen's either provided by animal fertilizer or by synthetic fertilizer. And many of the fertilizers we use, all the fertilizers we use now are petroleum-based or fossil carbon-based.
Many of them are, yes. And so, you know, to use the Haber-Bosch process for creating synthetic nitrogen, that in and of itself requires great amounts of fossil fuel energy to produce the nitrogen, and then of course the nitrogen itself is used in very large quantities in agricultural production.
But it then makes the land much more productive, any particular area much more productive than it would be.
That's correct.
This process.
And estimates from people that Pollan cites in his book suggest that up to 2/3 of the nitrogen in the proteins in our bodies, all of us, comes from synthetic nitrogen. So another way to look at it would be how many people could the Earth support if we didn't make synthetic nitrogen, and estimates suggest that that number is very high. So it's very interesting to think about how nitrogen plays a role.
One criticism of Michael Pollan has been that it's a real class-based argument. And let's go back to the tariffs and get a question from a student here, and then I want to follow up on that with you, Susan.
Hi, my name's Emily St. Aubin. I'm a senior wildlife ecology major here at UW-Madison, and my question is, how does socioeconomic status impact diet and nutrition?
So if you don't live in a Madison or an Ann Arbor or a place with a great farmer's market and a wide variety of those sorts of foods you can buy, or if you can't afford or have the time to shop, that's a big issue for people, a big issue for real people.
Right. Our country really has a very complicated system that makes many choices available to you, whether you live in Ann Arbor or Madison or Tampa, Florida. There's a combination of local foods available through a local marketing system and a large food production system that feeds the big grocery stores and just about everything in between. In Madison, we'd have the Willie Street Co-op or Whole Foods in addition to the big grocery stores and the little farm stands.
But people joke about, and I don't want to get in trouble with Whole Foods, but whole paycheck.
That's right.
And that it's more expensive. And I think folks at Whole Foods might say, well, we have different brands and people can actually shop more carefully. But there is really a class issue like this student was talking about.
The student brought up an excellent point, and I have some colleagues who look into food security as their research and as their area of interest. And food security to us means having access to enough food to keep you and your family healthy. And many people are struggling to get from paycheck to paycheck, pay the rent, pay the cost of health care and medicine, and just the kids' needs for what they need to go to school. And suddenly, how much our food costs, even though it's a big bargain, is an issue. And if we ate the way Michael Pollan asked us to eat, it would be more expensive, and he admits that himself. We could spend more on our food and probably have more healthy products, but you have to be wise, and it takes some study, and some people are willing to put that time in and some people aren't.
Michael Pollan makes all these arguments, wrote an open letter to the president-elect, wrote a book. When we come back on office hours, I'm going to give both of you a chance to be king for the day or food czar for the day and give some of your recommendations. So I hope you'll join us on office hours when we continue our discussion of politics and science of food in America.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours. Michael Pollan's obviously very out there in the media, prolific author, wrote a open letter to the president-elect. Let's pretend that I'm able to give you Barack Obama's private phone number, or you're able to go give a big speech in front of Congress. Sadly, you only have about a minute and a half here. What would be the sorts of things that you would do to try and improve agricultural policy and improve Americans' diet?
Well, one of the things Pollan talks about in his book is the way we approach something called the French paradox. And the French paradox is this idea that the French remain thin despite eating lots of saturated fat. And our approach is, must be something in their wine, must be the flavonoids in the wine. And in fact, we've manufactured a flavonoid pill for Americans to take. So if I had a chance to say something, I would say that it's really about the experience with food. It's not just what's in it. It's not just how we grow it. It's not just industrial agriculture, but it's our entire food experience, which includes the way we dine. It includes the way we think about eating with family. It includes exercise. It includes the whole picture. And so thinking about it in terms of its particulate matter, as we're talking about here, isn't the way I would approach the problem.
Okay. Susan, Barack Obama's private phone number, and you can give him a little advice.
Well, I think I'd point out that right now the dietary guidelines for Americans is being revised. By law, it has to be rewritten every 5 years, and so the 2010 version is well underway with a group of expert scientists from around the country, and that's the basis of MyPyramid. Anybody can go to mypyramid.gov and find some very reliable, well-researched, easy to understand advice about how to eat that'll meet your nutrient needs in the language of food that people understand. And I don't think we need a journalism professor to try to do it better.
One last point here before we have to leave office hours. He also makes the argument that we sort of have to redefine what food is in terms of what's going to get subsidies and what goes on the food pyramid. How do you define what food is? And he wants to say soda's not food and potato chips aren't food, but arugula is. But you can get awfully personal with that pretty quickly, can't you?
I think so. I think if, he'll say that we've moved from food to food products. They're not really food anymore because they're food products. But if you look at the ingredient list, as Sue was encouraging us to earlier, you'll see many things in there that certainly constitute food in anybody's definition, whether they're a scientist or a consumer. So I think you tread on very dangerous territory if you're not willing to call a food product a food.
Great. Susan, Irwin, thank you very much. I know there's been not a lot of controversy, but a bit of controversy on campus about the book, and there's been some farmers concerned about this, but not wanting to sound too much for a flack for the university, this is what we do. We bring up controversial things and we discuss them, and if we weren't reading it, we wouldn't be discussing it. So, thank all of you for discussing and listening to our discussion of food and politics. This has been Office Hours from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thanks for stopping by, and please join us again.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.